Good evening and welcome to our weekly history, theology, and philosophy lecture series. We've been doing these lectures for several years every week. Normally we would have been doing them as an in-person meetup here at Toronto Centre Place, but during the duration of the sheltering in place, of course we aren't having any in-person gatherings. But we want to keep presenting the content and keep gathering as a community online because that's part of our mission to do so. My background and training academically is as a medievalist, a medieval historian. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about in the course of our current pandemic is some of the ancient and medieval precedents for that, and that has led to the lecture we produced for this evening. My name is John Humours, and I serve as the pastor here at Toronto Centre Place and the coordinator of the meetup. We always begin with our mission, which is to invite everyone into community, to continually learn and grow, to abolish poverty and end suffering, to promote peace and justice, and to live life meaningfully together. And we continue to do that virtually, even if we can't be doing that in person. Next week, you might start to identify a theme in our upcoming lectures. But next week, we're going to have a lecture on biblical plagues from Exodus to Revelation. And so anyway, we'll look at how the Bible or the different authors of the Bible view these plagues and things happening like this in terms of their theological claims. But tonight we are going to talk about lessons learned from the Black Death. When this first got going at the beginning of March, a graphic started making its rounds, and I would see this quite regularly on social media, on Facebook, as people were reprinting this. Apparently it's by an outfit that I wasn't otherwise aware of called Visual Capitalist, and the idea of it is it's in two parts here. On the left, let's see if I can make my thing here work. On the left here is a timeline looking back from the present and the current. These are by size in terms of deaths of all the pandemics. Start looking from the present COVID pandemic in terms of these, going backwards to AIDS, HIV, the Spanish flu, and so on and so forth, from smallpox to here's the Black Death and pandemics stretching back in time. And then on the right side, it just has them next to each other. Again, with the big one here being the Black Death, the bubonic plague of the 14th century, smallpox, Spanish flu, the plague of Justinian, which you might not have even heard of before, but which is a previous bubonic plague that swept across Eurasia at the time of the Emperor Justinian towards the end of the Roman Empire, AIDS, and so on and so forth. And then right here, as of March 11th, the deaths that had taken place because of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 epidemic. So when we're doing this infographic, as we just kind of look at it a little more closely here, it correctly illustrates the fact that the Black Death was really the most deadly pandemic in history. That's why we're going to look at it tonight. This is a pretty horrific and really it's a unique moment in terms of the total destruction so rapidly in death. But I thought right from the start when I saw this graphic that it gave actually quite a misleading implication that, let's say, that COVID-19 is essentially just a speck in relation to all of these other things like SARS. We remember not much happening maybe during that. Some of these others that we may not have even heard of, the Hong Kong flu, the Asian flu, You maybe didn't know the Antonine Plague and so on and so forth, the Japanese smallpox epidemic of the 8th century AD. Anyway, as a result of that, I felt like when I saw this, this was almost saying to people, hey, there's so much more that's been more important than this, and yet we're obviously taking this so much more seriously, or we're having much more of a massive response in scale globally than anything we did for Ebola or anything like that. Okay, so if we are to correct now the dates, correct now where this would be, as I've done, I modified the graphic here, and we just add to what the deaths were. So as of the time before, there had only been, what does it say, 4.7 thousand deaths as of March, early middle March. Now, of course, there have been 211,000 deaths, which ranks the current pandemic in terms of total deaths above things like yellow fever, swine flu, and below the Great Plague of the 18th century and that Japanese smallpox epidemic. But in other words, although still deadly, it's still here in the low rungs, and it still makes it seem as if the threat is rather small. However, I've corrected this one now. If we were to add the COVID-19 and the projections of what might have happened, if we hadn't taken all of these measures, if we hadn't done the social distancing, if we hadn't taken so many precautions globally, experts were projecting that it could have as many as 40 million deaths over the course of the next couple of years. And so if that's the case, that would have made, anyway, the threat here of the COVID-19 pandemic, right in the same kind of range here. That's still tied almost with the Spanish flu functionally for number 3, and not that far, really, frankly, behind the smallpox. Still getting dwarfed by the bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, but nevertheless, it's a pretty big threat if we see it in those kind of proportions, and that, I think, wasn't made clear at all in this infographic. And so one of the takeaways that we're going to have, I think, of this lecture tonight, when we look at what we're doing now in contrast to the historical perspective on pandemics, is because we've been able to have this global collective response and so radically, hopefully, I mean, we're not done with it yet, but I mean, anyway, hopefully limiting deaths, if it turns out at the end of this, through heroic measures, that our global civilization is able to dramatically reduce the number of deaths, then the current pandemic will be historic for an all new reason. It'll be amazing because in the past there were no real responses to fast spreading pandemics anyway. Obviously, in the whole course of the very much slower moving AIDS epidemic, there has been a very dramatic response and the use of modern medicine to find all kinds of different ways to really arrest AIDS and treat it. But in the past before, with fast-moving pandemics that are more like the Spanish flu or the Black Death, and so on and so forth, there was very little response, and indeed almost the only thing that everyone did was simply let it run its course, and however many millions of people died, that's what essentially happened. We have not done that, and this is a new thing in this particular historical circumstance. So what I would like to propose is that we really should look at this chart as a call to action to keep COVID-19 on that bottom row if we can. It's not going to stay at just 211,000 deaths. There's going to be many more deaths in the course of this pandemic, but we do not want it, obviously, to get up the rungs by failing to continue our strong response to it. So that brings us to tonight's topic, the Black Death, so the most deadly pandemic in recorded history. So it took place largely between 1347 and 1351, so the middle of what's sometimes called the calamitous 14th century. That's towards the end of the Middle Ages. So first off, I want to say one thing about the Black Death is the scale is essentially unimaginable, I think. If you want somebody who lived through it, it's one of those things that are experiences that unless you were there, you just are never going to be able to conceive of what it would have been like to be doing it. The scale, for one thing, is we don't have exact numbers of what the scale even was. There was no census in the 14th century, so all the numbers are estimated. In England, for example, nobody had done anything approaching a census since William the Conqueror and the Domesday Book, which had been, 3 centuries earlier. So one thing that is that these are all estimates, and so it's estimated that somewhere between 70 million on the low end and maybe as many as 200 million are kind of the more extreme possibilities, died across Eurasia and North Africa. That higher number would be depending on if the world population was actually a lot larger than some people estimate that it was. In any event, it lowered the global population maybe from 475 million people on the whole planet to maybe 350 to 375 million people on the planet. So a big drop in just a couple years, in the whole global population. At least a third of the people in Europe, and some people argue as much as 60% of people in Europe died. Certainly it varied depending place to place. If it was a third of Europe, that's perhaps 20 million people or more died between 1347 and 1351. Again, if you can imagine everybody you know, everyone in your family, and take it for every 3 people, 1 to die is already just incalculable and unimaginable. It took Europe 200 years for its population to recover to pre-plague peaks. So for the next 200 years, there were fewer people in Europe than there had been in 1345. Cities were especially hard hit, as you can imagine, because when, as we now know how diseases are spread, when people are in close proximity and there's overcrowding and you're working together and every other thing, the transmission comes much faster. And of course, we also are aware of modern germ theory, and so cities in antiquity and the Middle Ages and really up through the early modern times were just filthy, and so as a result they were just filled with disease transmission. So during the Black Death, 800 people per day were dying in Paris. And that was reducing the overall population of the city from 100,000. So it was probably, that seems like a small city these days because of our modern scale and sensibilities. It may have been essentially the largest city in Western Europe. 100 drops from 100,000 down to 50,000 people. Perhaps 80% of Florence's population died. 2/3 of the people in Venice and even other smaller cities like Hamburg and other places in Germany lost 2/3 of their population. Half was not unusual when it came to towns and cities. Cities have multiple chronicles where they talk about how they simply buried their dead in mass graves. This is an illumination from a manuscript showing the citizens of Tournai in France burying their dead. The image is from about 1353. There are all sorts of accounts where as quickly as the citizens of a town were able to dig a big ditch, that ditch would be filled with bodies and they'd have to dig another ditch because of how fast, how rapidly the deaths were occurring. We do have the remnants of that. So archaeology has spent a lot more time working on antiquity, so digging up the really ancient remains. Nevertheless, there's been much more work in medieval archaeology more recently. And so, for example, this is a mass grave from the Black Death that was dug up in Toulouse, France. And one of these is one, I think, where they were able now to do some genetic testing and genetic studies that help with the epidemiology of understanding what actually was happening, what the disease was in terms of the Black Death. Although the cities were most affected or affected a lot more, the plague also actually spread quickly across the countryside. And so the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages actually were rural peasants. And while the outbreaks hit the cities first and very deadly, the pestilence also quickly spread across the countryside, and accounts talk about how peasants died as they worked in the fields, how whole fields would just be full of peasants and stinking from the corpses because there would be nobody to come along afterwards and bury anyone. Also affecting that. There was a rapid depopulation of much of the countryside. One study shows that in Germany, prior to 1346, there were 170,000 settlements all across the countryside. And then in the century after the first round of the plague and the subsequent recurrences, some 40,000, or almost a quarter of all of the settlements in Germany, were abandoned. The plague was highly contagious and deadly. So if you had an enclosed community like a prison and like a monastery, and we have seen this in COVID-19 with prisons again, with factories in certain circumstances that are continuing to be open, and especially, unfortunately, in senior facilities and nursing homes. It turns out at the time, though, back then when they didn't understand what was going on, if one person contracted the plague, it generally spread to everybody in that community. So, for example, every friar in the Franciscan convent at Carcassonne died. Of the 140 Dominican friars at Montpellier, only 7 of them survived. Often, it's spread across everywhere. So off in Ireland, we have the account of the plague by a certain friar, John Klein, who wrote, "The whole world is in the grasp of the evil one," he felt. And he himself, as he was writing it, was the lone survivor in his monastery that was otherwise simply filled with the bodies of his dead companions in Kilkenny, Ireland. As he kept a record of the experience, he wrote, "I leave parchment to continue the work, if perchance any man survive, and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence and carry out the work that I have begun." As is noted on the parchment by someone who came along later and in a later hand, Brother John also died of the pestilence. The plague was no respecter of persons. So in addition to the peasants in the countryside and the merchants in the town, the plague also killed royals and nobility. So the pestilence killed King Alfonso XI of Castile. It also killed Joanna, who was the daughter of King Edward III of England. She died on the way to marry Alfonso's son and heir. The queens of France, Aragon, and Navarre all died, as did the Dauphin's wife, so the heir to the throne of France's wife. More queens, it seems, died than kings. Women, especially in the first round, were perhaps a little more susceptible or died in greater numbers than did men, possibly because of being in homes and homes being a source of where fleas were, as we'll see. John Cantacuzene, the emperor of Byzantium, lost his son to the plague. And there were many, many more examples of nobles succumbing. This is also true in the princes of the church. The papacy had relocated in this area of the Middle Ages to southern France, to Avignon. This is a photograph of the palace of the popes in Avignon. And so a third of the cardinals, the princes of the church in Avignon, died. In England, there was a quick succession of archbishops. So John Stratford, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died of the plague in August of 1348. John of Ufford, his successor, died of the plague the next year in May of 1349. And then his successor, Thomas Bradwardine, survived only 3 months, dying of the plague in August of 1349. So 3 Archbishops of Canterbury all dying of the plague within the space of 1 year. The physicians and clergy died in especially large numbers. So they had a very high mortality rate proportionally, especially the good ones who did their jobs. So some noble clergymen especially ran off to the countryside and self-isolated, and as some doctors refused to go and see patients, and in those cases they probably had a much better chance of surviving than the ones who went and helped people in need. And so there was an especially large mortality among parish priests, the church members who, let's say, did the most work and were the most help to parishioners, who died in very large numbers, as did, of course, like we mentioned, of the friars and monks often. In Avignon, again, the papal city, Guy de Chauliac, who is a physician there, he admitted in his notes that he only made medical visits to avoid infamy, so that people just didn't say he was a coward and he was a terrible doctor because he wasn't going around and helping people. But he confessed in his own account that he was in continual fear whenever he went to treat anyone. Of 24 physicians in the city of Venice, only 4 survived the plague. And although the physicians might have helped in terms of comforting people, in fact, they had no remedy for the disease and no effective treatment. What was the plague like? As it's described by contemporaries, it was gruesome, painful, and quick. In its most common form, the pestilence was bubonic plague, whose symptoms included the appearance of swellings or buboes in the groin, neck, and armpits. And when lanced, these would ooze blood and pus. They're caused by internal bleeding. Other symptoms included headaches, painful joints, nausea, vomiting, and a general feeling of malaise. Giovanni Boccaccio, the celebrated Italian humanist who lived through the plague, described its symptoms. The plague, he says, first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the 2 said parts of the body, this deadly gavacciolo, or bubo, soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous. As the gavacciolo, the bubo, had been and was still an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. So after those symptoms, it was followed by acute fever, vomiting blood, and then most victims died 2 to 7 days after their initial infection. Just as a mention of this, there's a little bit of we can see in Boccaccio some of the immediate influence that the plague had on the survivors. So Boccaccio had direct experience. His mistress, Fiammetta, who was the illegitimate daughter of the King of Naples, died of the plague. And then Boccaccio himself, his famous work, the Decameron, written just after the plague is ending, has as its overall narration, so the setting for the story, has 7 young women and 3 young men flee plague-ridden Florence for the countryside, and then each of them tell a series of stories. And so that's the framing device for the Decameron, and that, of course, is a model for later works like Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, where all the pilgrims going on pilgrimage to Canterbury also tell tales in that way. In addition to that bubonic form of the plague, there were additional types of plague present. as recorded by contemporaries. So contemporaries noted a pneumonic plague and a septicemic plague. So both of these, although rarer, were more deadly. So, the bubonic plague is already quite deadly. But some people, maybe 20% of victims, could have recovered from the bubonic plague. That's probably the most of that could have possibly. Only 5% at most survived pneumonic, and with septicemic plague, death is essentially, absolutely certainty. The pneumonic plague infects the lungs, causing a fever, a cough, and blood-tinged sputum. So people spit up blood. The septicemic plague infects the blood, and the symptoms include purple patches that result from tiny blood clots forming throughout the body. These both are a lot faster than the bubonic plague. The buboes take a little while to grow and have all that happen. The pneumonic plague, though, can kill within 36 hours. The septicemic within 24 hours or less of contraction. And so these fit with the descriptions that contemporaries have of people catching sick and just almost immediately dying. It's an amazingly scary time for anybody to be around. We now know that the cause of all three of these types of plague that was observed in the 1347 to 51 pandemic, the Black Death, they're caused by a bacterium which has been identified as Yersinia pestis. So unlike our present pandemic, the COVID-19, which is spread by a virus, coronavirus, bacterial diseases like the three forms of plague can be treated with antibiotics, which kill bacteria. At least they kill bacteria until we have successfully bred super bacteria that are resistant to penicillin and that sort of thing. But anyway, for now anyway, the plague is under control or mostly wiped out because of our modern invention of antibiotics. And that's why the plague no longer returns, at least not as a pandemic that threatens the planet ever. We found that the bacteria is itself spread by fleas, and it also can be spread by lice. Anyway, little bugs that are infected with the bacteria, and then they bite humans and animals and regurgitate the bacteria into the wound, infecting animals and humans. Since the early 20th century, it's been theorized that the infected fleas spread with the rat population. And that is based especially on some studies of plague that occurred in the early 20th century in India, where that was the way it was being transmitted. Modern epidemiologists are questioning whether that fits or that model fits how we see the plague spreading in the 14th century. It's also completely possible that other animals were involved. The humans are living with all kinds of animals in the Middle Ages in very close quarters. And it's also quite possible that human fleas that are just living on people themselves, or humans lice that are living on people, that those are potentially also responsible for transmitting the disease person to person, as the people were in quite close proximity. However, in the 14th century, although we understand that true cause now, that true cause was fully unknown at all to contemporaries. So in contrast to how we are able to feel right now in the 21st century during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we have all sorts of expertise and science, and we have a great understanding of what's happening and how we can also slow and in some cases prevent transmission of the virus. The Black Death at the time was all the more frightening for the people living since its actual cause was completely unknown. No matter what people might have speculated or their theories, they weren't necessarily able to, be proven, and they actually were not any of them correct. They didn't understand what it was. Where it came from was known. So they were able to understand, based on what areas were hit first, that the pandemic had come from the east. So it had come from somewhere in the Mongol Empire, and it had first made its way to the west in the Crimea, in the Black Sea, which is kind of in Ukraine, in a part of Ukraine that is occupied by Russia nowadays. But back then, it was mostly part of the Mongol Empire, of which, except for there were colonies that were owned by Genoa. Genoa was one of the merchant Italian republics that had had its rise in the Central Middle Ages and had spread European wealth and economy through this rise of this mercantile class. So Genoese ships returning from trading with trading partners that went across the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road that ultimately connected Western Europe to China, brought the plague then back in their ships to Constantinople, and from thence to Pisa and other places, Sicily, other places in Italy. One of the reasons that this was able to happen was in the preceding century, at the end of the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors had conquered all of Central Asia, and indeed the steppes and much of the Middle East, including Iran and Iraq, and then also had conquered China and had created just one of the vastest empires that had ever existed. Because of Mongol, what became then after an initial, it was initially very devastating to be conquered by the Mongols, but after you were conquered by the Mongols and you were part of their empire for a whole long time, you were exposed to what is functionally a much larger trading zone, a much larger economic zone that had existed, I guess, any time in history. So now, because of the Mongol peace, because the Mongol emperors were allowing trade caravans to cross all across Asia, connecting really China and the West almost quite directly for the first time in centuries, it allowed this kind of disease transmission to happen much more easily, in the same way, frankly, that our easy travel that we have in the 21st century of people flying around in jet planes is really what caused the global transmission of the coronavirus from China to everywhere. So the Black Death began in China as well and spread west across those trade routes. You can kind of see the transmission lines that are going right along there. The two trade routes, the one hitting the Muslim Near East and going north to Kaffa there in the Crimea. Let's see if we can make this happen. There it is. Across Central Asia on the Silk Road to Kaffa, and from there to Italy, Genoa. So the pandemic spread along those trade routes, and then from there to Europe, and these dots are all the different cities that eventually everybody gets it. So 14th century Europe, in retrospect, was especially vulnerable to plague. So a lot of times we think of the Middle Ages as a time of decline, and certainly the end of the Roman Empire, there was a whole long period of time in late antiquity where the economy and the population and the capacity of the state were all radically declining in Europe. And that continued for a certain amount of time in the earliest part of the Middle Ages that are sometimes called the Dark Ages. But from the Central Middle Ages on through here to the 14th century, there was actually a big population uptick in Europe, and indeed a significant increase in wealth and economy in the course of that. And so as of the middle of the 14th century, Europe had actually grown to be overpopulated in regards to how much food it was able to produce for itself. And as a result, the populations were subject to regular famine if there was a bad crop year. And so there had been several great famines in the beginning of the 14th century, and it had left survivors. Not everybody dies in a famine, but sometimes when you live through a famine and you were malnourished through a whole long period of time, you were left as a result with a weakened immune system that makes you more susceptible to later threats such as plague. 14th century Europeans also lacked some of the immunities. If we go back to this history of the pandemic charts, it's hard to see it in the timeline, but the the Black Death is here. It was long time before that till you get back to the plague of Justinian, which would have been the last major outbreak of the this plagues caused by the Y. pestis bacteria. And so that again was on that top list of the overall killers in the middle of the 6th century that killed maybe 30 to 50 million people as the Roman Empire was declining and was falling. So after centuries without plague, Europeans therefore had less immunity than they would have had in the immediate aftermath of the plague of Justinian. They had been too many years without a major occurrence of these plagues. Also, as I mentioned, they had no effective treatment. They did have physicians, and the physicians were trained, and they were university trained often, but medieval medicine was based entirely on ideas of ancient Greek natural philosophers, especially Hippocrates, so of the famous Hippocratic Oath fame, and the doctor-physician Galen and Aristotle and others. They created a very elaborate system that taught that humans had 4 natural humors, or biological systems, that needed to be in balance in order to maintain proper health. And if any one of those systems got out of balance, that caused disease. So humoralism, as it's sometimes called, was the basis for Western medicine, traditional Western medicine, really for centuries after. People were still actually trained in this, essentially that kind of philosophy into, let's say, the early 19th century, although it was being displaced at that point by the emergence of modern Western medicine. So we'll look at what these 4 humors are just to kind of understand this system. Essentially, the humors are felt to be your different kind of fluid systems that are inside. So your blood is an obvious one, but they also identify your phlegm, and then black bile and yellow bile, which is less science-based. So each one of those, according to ancient Greek philosophy and again the training of humoralism, resides in a commanding organ. So the liver for blood, the gallbladder for the yellow bile, black bile in the spleen, the phlegm in the brain and the lungs. Each one of these is associated with the ancient Greek ideas of the 4 elements, air, earth, fire, and water, and therefore are associated with their associated qualities. So moist and warm, warm and dry, dry and cold, cold and moist. And so essentially, if you have an excess of blood in that humor, one of those things it'll show is that you'll be moist and warm. That might seem like, therefore, you have like a fever and you're sweating. And your temperament then that is being expressed from that imbalance is that you're going to be sanguine. And so the 4 of these are sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. And these are still words that we use even if we no longer identify melancholia that we have with having an excess of black bile in our spleen. So humoralism, unfortunately, when it came to treating the plague, was often worse than nothing. So the general adaptation of humoralism would have been quite fine, because just teaching people to be healthy and lead a healthy, balanced life and to eat a balanced diet, this sort of thing, there was nothing wrong with that as preventative or general health. However, the kinds of invasive treatments that are based on humoralism include rebalancing your bodily fluids by doing such things as, if you have too much, if you're too sanguine, bloodletting. And so that's one of the more famous ones, cutting making a cut and removing some of the blood, draining some of the blood out of a sick person. You can imagine that that's not going to be particularly helpful, despite the philosophical theory, in treating an actual plague victim. Same thing, emetics, which is to say causing people to vomit, laxatives, and so on, are often worse than nothing. So the papal physician in Avignon recognized in the course of all of this activity, all of the treatments that he was doing, that bloodletting was completely ineffective against the plague, although apparently he continued to prescribe it for people in Avignon he didn't like. So he didn't tell them that it wasn't going to help. So what was the cause then, if you were a natural philosopher in the 14th century? They realized through experience that bloodletting didn't do anything, it didn't help. But the idea that they had about humouralism, their commitment to that ancient Greek philosophical ideal was so strong, it did not cause them actually to abandon the system of humouralism, which, as I mentioned, continued to hold sway for many centuries afterward. Instead, that papal physician who I mentioned, and actually many other contemporary natural philosophers, physicians, scientists in the Middle Ages at the time, concluded that the plague actually was incurable, and that it was the result of a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. So in other words, there had been a cosmic astrological result that was affecting everybody, and that there was absolutely nothing that anybody could do about it. As you can imagine, the explanation of a planetary conjunction wasn't particularly compelling to the masses. So the masses don't look up in the sky and say, oh, I guess those two planets have moved too close together, and that's what caused our entire world to be turned upside down. So instead, for common folk especially, the plague was very clearly an obvious sign of God's displeasure for the sins of humanity. And one of the popular results here in this image is of doing public penance, public self-flagellation, mortifying the body in order to atone for those sins. According to darker popular sentiments, unfortunately, there were people who looked for scapegoats and who reached the all too familiar bigoted conclusion that the other, the person who is not like me, they must be responsible. And so all across Europe, beginning in Spain, but across France and the Low Countries, and then kind of with a lot of intensity in Germany, Jews were blamed for the plague and were massacred in popular riots. So that's kind of an overview of what happened in the plague and the Black Death, why it happened, and how it was experienced. I want to look at some of the results of the Black Death, and then I want to talk about a couple of the lessons I think we can draw from it. So some of the results of the Black Death were that after those massacres, Jewish people and communities who survived, they largely started leaving from the West, and they started to immigrate in quite large numbers to Poland and Eastern Europe. So the contemporary king of Poland offered sanctuary, in part because there were so few people living in his land, and he saw the need to have these very useful members of potential members of his society to relocate to towns and the countryside in his country. And so that began this long chapter in Jewish history of homeland, not really, but anyway, in Eastern Europe. Another result was sort of a morbid outlook that expressed itself in art and in other ways. So we already saw for example, Boccaccio and his Decameron and how that played out in literature. It also, the imagery of death made its way as a frequent component now in artwork. And so here's an example that is pretty amazing. It's a century later, a fresco in Palermo called The Triumph of Death. And you can kind of see in the middle of it, Death is riding as a skeletal warrior here, riding on a horse through the middle of people unawares. There's a close-up of that. Another example, this painting is really amazing, by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's even a century again after that. It's also called The Triumph of Death. Ever since I found this, I've made this image actually. I've had this be my desktop background on my computer because it's such an amazing image. It's probably too morbid for me to have that. I should have a happier picture on my computer. To me, this looks like it's the inspiration for the episode in Game of Thrones where the zombie army comes and attacks the town, and they're just barely able to. They don't fight them off. They're just barely able to escape. Jon Snow is able to escape on the boat as the zombies overwhelm the entire town. And so you can kind of see as they close in on it here, there's death again on the horse like that. And then as the people are all in here dying, some among them are some of the other skeleton warriors, there's in fact just this whole armies of these skeletal warriors as the people are making their way here into the realm of the dead. Another frequent image is this image of the Dance of Death, the Danse Macabre, and the idea of it here is that death has become a leveler. And so this is a painting on a fresco in a church in Slovenia, and you can kind of see once again death is dancing along with mortals, and everyone's immortal, so including the peasants, including queens and kings and cardinals, bishops. As we saw, death takes everyone unawares and unexpectedly, and it can happen at any moment because the plague can always relapse. So there's sort of a morbid sense that overtakes, in a way, the culture of the survivors. Nevertheless, for some survivors, death was sort of a leveler in the sense that economic conditions do seem to have improved over the following decades. So after recovering from the initial devastation, which was certainly terrible, economic conditions may have improved for survivors. So in a relative sense, if a third of the people die, then there is in fact a lot more land for everybody that's left. In an agricultural society, it is in that sense a zero-sum game if there is no increase in technology, and there wasn't anywhere near as rapid of that kind of increase as we've been experiencing the last couple centuries. So that meant that per peasant rents would decrease, and indeed land prices, so the ability to buy land, all of those went down, and then labor, because it was so much more scarce, became more valuable. And so as a result, many landowners felt that kind of crunch. They had to, generally speaking, end the obligations of serfdom, since serfs could just run away and go to a different employer, and serfdom in the West anyway largely disappeared as peasants became free peasants as in the end of that kind of long trend, in the end of the feudal age. Other results then, there's a continuing emphasis on creating labor-saving techniques. So that higher cost of labor continued what had already been a long-standing trend in the Middle Ages, which was focusing on labor-saving technology. So labor had always been a little more scarce, but it got scarce again now as a result of the plague. And labor-saving technology had been more or less unnecessary in antiquity. When you have an empire like Rome that just has this massive amount of slave labor, then necessity doesn't ever get you to, even if you understand the principle of a windmill, like this medieval representation, you don't bother to make them because you simply have people to do the work of grinding wheat and so on and so forth. Now there is an increasing reliance, increasing number of windmills. This becomes and other kinds of labor-saving techniques, in other words, technology, that ultimately, that trend line leads to the modern era, whose focus has really been on ongoing technology and ongoing elimination of the need for labor. That trend line has gotten, again, perilous in the 21st century, as there's so many different ways that we can eliminate the need for people from the economy, that there's way less capacity to have jobs, and that's still something that we're have to be looking to grapple with as a society going forward, but we can see the trend line going here. There were some results that in terms of capacity to treat pandemics. So although the Black Death didn't immediately lead to a revolution in medicine, as I mentioned, the philosophical basis, the humouralism, continued for centuries. Nevertheless, the experience with the pandemic did cause people to learn and develop certain techniques that were actually useful and effective. So as the plague continued to recur again and again, what observers noticed, so doctors noticed, was that the first time it went through, everybody died. The second time it went through, the people who had already survived the first time were way less likely to get it, so many fewer got it. Especially the second time through, it affected especially the children, the people who had not been survivors and who weren't necessarily immune. And so on and so forth, where there was more and more natural immunity as the centuries went on than there had been before. So that got the gears rolling in terms of understanding that. And it also, quite early, when people saw how the plague was spreading from city to city, the practice of quarantining cities or regions where the plague broke out was already developed in the 14th century during recurrences of the plague. So for example, in 1377, and during a recurrence, the city-state of Ragusa, which is now the city of Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast, Croatia, I think it's in Croatia, Yugoslavia it was. Anyway, the Dubrovnik was quarantined because of repeated outbreaks of plague. So what are some of the lessons learned? One thing that the people at the time felt was, even though they felt that they finally had ended the plague after the first round of it went through the whole population, unfortunately for them, there were recurrences that happened, and in some cases the recurrences, as I mentioned, the next time it broke out, it was somehow even more cruel because it killed the children that they needed to replace the rest of the population. So anyway, that original outbreak was followed by recurrences 1360, 1374, 1400, 1438, and again and again and again, so on, up until the 1600s, when it largely stopped being pandemic form in Europe, but continued to affect other regions until the early 20th century. So that was one, unfortunately, lesson that the people at the time learned. I think a critical lesson that we can learn in retrospect is not to give into our base instincts, to give into our worst natures. So when there are extreme conditions, when the whole world is being turned upside down, society is more flexible. You can unleash extraordinary reactions at this time, and we certainly have done that here in the 21st century, where we've shut down the vast global economy. So big things are able to happen. However, this is not a moment to give into base bigotry as Christians in the medieval West did by scapegoating, by massacring their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors, and expelling them from their lands. This isn't the time to do the thing we might wanted to do ourselves for, again, a base instinct reason and say, oh, well, while the pandemic's happening, let's scapegoat the Chinese and call it the Chinese virus, or let's use this as an opportunity to just ban all immigration. That's obviously taking the wrong strain in the wrong direction. Another lesson that we can look is, even though there may have been some economic benefits for some of the peasants who survived, certainly not for the people who died, the reality is those took a long time to realize. And so although when we do this thing as historians and we can telescope the whole story, it turns out that when you're talking about a pandemic that is going on for like 4 years, and then the recovery, which is another 20, 30, 40, 50 years after that, in the hindsight of history, that seems like, oh, well, that was a really wonderful thing for all the people that survived. Nevertheless, if you were living through it in actual human years, these benefits, such that they were, took a long time to realize. And I think we can only say that whatever comes out of this experience that we're having right now as a positive result will also take a long time to realize. Another lesson that is very clear, I think, is that the survivors too have a kind of trauma. And so people that are exposed to so much mortality can't help but be changed by this. In the case of medieval Europeans, this kind of led to morbid sensibility, to fatalism. In some cases, there were different responses. Some people theorized that this might have led to more focusing on this life and living this life to its fullest. Certainly in Italy, soon thereafter, this is the time period when the Renaissance is actually sparked. Nevertheless, lots of places throughout the West, and certainly the Middle East and everywhere, experienced this trauma, and the Renaissance only happened in Italy. So it's not necessarily a direct consequence of pandemic leads to, has X and Y result. But in any event, whatever the positive results are, again, one of the lessons we can learn is that people can't help but come out of such an experience being quite changed. And so that's something also to be thinking about as we look forward. And so those are, for me anyway, some of the lessons I think we can learn from the Black Death. Thank you very much. And so, Leandro, I don't know if we have got questions or comments. No? Well, that is just fine, because it has been a long day for me. So I really appreciate that you've been with us and that you've been watching along with us. I hope this was interesting, and maybe that I brought out some things that you weren't aware of from this particular chapter in history. And maybe it gets us thinking about where we are now. And we'll continue with our series next week on the similar topic, as we look to plagues in the Bible, from Exodus to Revelation.